without much delay, I would like to welcome Shri Jairam Ramesh for the next session. And if possible, I would also request the panelists to stay for this session. We are eagerly waiting to listen to Shri Jairam Ramesh. I mean, it is our pleasure, also a privilege to be hearing him today as the closing in the closing session, and listening to his visions of how the country and globally how the movement could be built towards a better, positive, climate resilient, climate action oriented society. Shri Jairam Ramesh doesn't need much introduction. I mean, I'm also a very not actually qualified to introduce him in that sense. But just for information of everybody, he's a seasoned statesman and also an Indian economist and politician belonging to Indian National Congress. He has extensive experience in serving in the Planning Commission of India and different ministries, Ministry of Industry, Advisory Board on an Energy Cabinet Secretariat. He's taken up many ministries, like I said before, in the rural development, in drinking water and sanitation, environment and forest, commerce and power. He brings here also on the table decades worth of practice, experience, and a holistic wisdom on climate change and sustainability. He's authored many books, one of which has recently come out, which is called The Light of Asia, the poem that defined the Buddha. And we would really hope Shri Ramesh also talks about that as well. Another book that we all have read is The Green Signals, Economy, Growth, and Democracy in India. In India, very pertinent as well. I mean, it's quite a timeless kind of a book. What was relevant then is relevant now. So a very warm welcome, Shri Jairam Ramesh ji. Thank you so much for taking out time. It's truly, I would repeat myself, it's truly a pleasure and a privilege to have you here for the closing session. But before we hear you talk about the visions of a sustainable planet, I would request Anand Pindarkar, our partner from Sprouts, to quickly come in, and he has a very interesting surprise for us. So over to you, Anand.
Thank you, Manvi. Thank you, Jairam Ramesh. I hope you remember that we had met at RA at the RA Conservation Meet, as well as SSDS keynote was there. We've been working for last 30 years trying to document the biodiversity of the Bombay coastline, as well as of the RA milk colony. And we put together the material of that into a book, which is on its way very soon. But before that, we've created an app for public access, a free app that is there. So if with your permission, we could sort of release it in front of you, since you've done so much of phenomenal work in for coastal regulatory zone, making it a very, very strong act at Port of Prime, although it's kind of got diluted in the recent times. So with your permission, sir, if you could
please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Later, I would request all the participants to download and have a look at the app as well. Thank you, sir. And I hope you will also have a look at the app and send us your comments. We would
Thank
like
you.
to hear from you. It's been 30 years of work and about over 100 students and individuals have contributed to this work. And we hope that while the coastal road is being constructed, at least some bits of this information, of course, we presented some of it to the court, but some consideration is given to this silent biodiversity which exists. So over to you for your keynote speech.
Very good. Thank you very much. And this app of yours fits in very well with the few remarks that I wanted to make. We are all now caught up with the headlines in the news from COP26 in Glasgow, which has just come to an end. And while what happened in Glasgow will be analyzed and will be reviewed, I think it's important to recognize that we, in our obsession or fixation with the vagaries of climate change, we tend to overlook the other environmental issues, the other planetary boundaries that are under stress. And some of these boundaries we have already crossed. Now, some years ago in 2009, the Stockholm Resilience Center identified 9 planetary boundaries, one of which, of course, was climate change. One of it was climate change induced by global warming. However, there were other planetary boundaries which we need to be concerned about. Ozone depletion. We have the deforestation. We have loss of biodiversity, which is directly linked with the app that we have just seen now. We have the biogeochemical cycle, the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle. We have the particulate emissions, aerosol pollution. We are seeing it in many parts of India right now, which are faced with a health emergency on account of buildup of particulate matter. And we have the problem of chemical contamination, a very serious issue. And we have the hydrological cycle, the water balance. So these are different planetary boundaries. Climate change is one of them. But these other boundaries, the ozone, the biodiversity, the particulate matter pollution, the chemical contamination, the water cycle, the biogeochemical cycle, nitrogen and phosphorus, are equally crucial, are equally important. And I think it's important, it's therefore very, very, very necessary for us to ground our debate in this whole variety of issues. After all, in 1992, when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed, the UN Convention on Biodiversity also was signed. But we don't talk too much about the Convention on Biodiversity. We talk largely of the UNFCCC. And we know now today there is an intimate link between the loss of biodiversity and climate change itself. The second point I'd make is that increasingly, we have to look at these issues not just as environmental issues, but these are public health issues. Whether it's climate change, whether it's ozone depletion, and certainly when it comes to particulate matter, pollution, aerosol buildup, and chemical contamination, the impacts are immediate, are short-term in the public health. So environment does not present long-term health hazards. It presents very short-term health hazards. It has health consequences, public health consequences in the short term. Sometimes these are reflected in increased morbidity. And very often they could also be reflecting in increased mortality. We have seen in the last 1 year, for example, how people who are affected by the buildup of particulate matter have been more vulnerable to the effects of COVID-19 infections. So I think when we look at environment, we often tend to look at environment as independent issues. It's as an issue relating to economic growth. The trade-off between economic growth and environmental protection is very much on our minds. But I think we need to look now more closely, far more minutely, and in greater detail on the relationship between these planetary boundaries that I talked about and public health. And this is something that would also get a lot of political traction. It would also help build up greater public consciousness and get greater public support in favor of policies that protect the environment. Because there is a general feeling in many circles that environment, is some sort of a NGO pastime. It's some sort of a upper middle class elitist pastime, which does not have much relevance for a poor developing country like ours, which requires factories, which requires urbanization, which requires investments and so on. I think nothing can be more wrong and nothing can be more dangerous than this line of thinking. And this traditional grow now, pay later model that we have 20 years or 25 years of fast economic growth, build all the highways, build all your factories, build all your infrastructure, and worry about the consequences, the ecological consequences of that later, is a most dangerous and destabilizing assumption. Mainly because this process of fast economic expansion has an impact on the environment, and environmental disturbances, ecological imbalances have impacts on public health. So we need to bring the public health concern to be the central concern in environmental debates. Why are we protecting forests? Why are we cleaning up the air? Why are we, cleaning up our water? Why are we concerned about loss of biodiversity? It's because of public health. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic particularly is a reminder, is a very grim reminder to us that loss of biodiversity impacts on public health. And one of the consequences of that impact is the COVID-19 pandemic that we have seen. Thirdly, of course, countries, ultimately these agreements that we are now been talking about, whether it's the Montreal Protocol to deal with ozone depletion or the UNFCCC COPs, the Conference of Parties on Climate Change, or the UN Convention on Biodiversity. These are international agreements. These are multilateral agreements that are entered into by national governments. But increasingly, we are beginning to be sensitive to and beginning to get aware that environmental management is not just the responsibility of the federal government or the union government or the central government. You have state governments and you have local governments, and of course, you have communities. So, it's at multiple levels these interventions take place. The laws can be federal in nature. The laws can be central in nature. For example, we have the Wildlife Protection Act, we have the Environment Protection Act, we have the Forest Conservation Act, we have the Air Pollution Control Act, we have the Water Pollution Control Act, we have the Central Pollution Control Board, the State Pollution Control Boards. So we can have, these at higher levels of governance. But the real issue is enforcement of these laws, the enforcement of these regulations. And there, to take an example, in the coastal areas, for example, we have the CRZ rules, the Coastal Regulation Zone rules. These are mandated under the Environment Protection Act. But the enforcement of these rules ultimately require the full involvement of the state governments, they involve local governments, and ultimately they also involve the participation of local communities as well. So I think we have to look at this as a multi-level process of environmental governance. It's not just the federal government, and not just the union government that signs these international agreements that has to be bothered about these issues. State governments have to be bothered. I'm glad Aditya Thackeray has gone to Glasgow and he spoke about making Mumbai resilient to increase in sea levels. These are the types of concerns that are going to increase in the future. And then local governments will have to, again, to take the example of Mumbai, one of the remarkable stories is how the municipal corporation responded to the COVID-19 pandemic, and that was a response of the local government, not just of the state government or the union government. So my point is that environmental governance will involve multiple stakeholders, multiple levels of intervention, community, local government, state government, and then the union government, of course, at the apex level. Now, we have very progressive laws, we have progressive standards, we have rules, we have regulations, we have institutions, but sadly, the enforcement machinery has been very weak. The will to enforce these laws has not been as forthcoming as it should have. And I think in the years to come, there will be extraordinary pressure from us, both domestically and internationally, to be far more serious about enforcement of these laws. There's no point going to Glasgow and posing as a great Vishwaguru of the environment when you're not enforcing your own laws in your backyard, when you're diluting your environmental laws, when you're weakening your environmental regulations, when you're emasculating your institutions like the National Green Tribunal and so on. So I think, this institutional strengthening, a very important aspect of domestic accountability. And in today's world, what is domestic, what is international, that boundary is getting blurred and is very fuzzy. And we have to therefore, pay far greater attention to the enforcement of these standards, of these rules, these regulations, these laws, and the institutions that we have, both in the government as well as in the judiciary, because these are institutions ultimately that will enforce accountability on the executive and put pressure on the executive to enforce the standards that it has set up. So all in all, sustainability is something that we have come to recognize as absolutely fundamental and basic. We need rapid economic growth. We need inclusive economic growth so that the benefits of growth flow to all sections of society. But in addition to growth being rapid and inclusive, it also has to be ecologically sustainable. Because if it's not ecologically sustainable, both in the short term and the medium term, and ecological sustainability, I mean really in the short term, then that growth is not going to be terribly inclusive. It's not going to be equitable as well. It's not what you do in 2070 that counts. It's what you do in the 2020s, what you do in the 2030s, in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, in the next 15 years, as we make this transition. And the fact is that this transition is inevitable. The transition in transportation, the transition in industry, the transition in agriculture, the transition in our power sector, in our energy sector, it's inevitable. It's bound to happen. Technology is advancing rapidly. Costs are falling dramatically. When I was environment minister in 2009, when I took over, solar prices were over 15 rupees a unit. And today, you are putting up solar power plants at around 2.5 rupees a unit, less than 2.5 rupees a unit. So technology has really taken off and prices have come crashing down, making these interventions far more cost effective than they were in the past. So let me end by saying that sustainability concerns are very much integral to the process of economic growth in India. They are not a luxury. They're not something that we can postpone to the future, what I've called the grow now, pay later model. I think we have to grow now and protect now. We have to grow now and preserve now. And that's really the big challenge for our planners, for civil society, and for governments across the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. If I may ask you, would you say that we have to grow up now and take responsibility on?
It's a good way of putting up. It's a good way of saying, yes. We should stop. I mean, the mantra should be not grow now, but grow up now. That's very well put. Very well put on, and it's very, very well put. Absolutely. We need to grow up now. And, the reason why we have to grow up is because it's in our interest. You can't pollute your way to prosperity. You can't deforest your way to prosperity. You have to, ultimately, it all boils down to public health. This is, I think, one of the big things that I have been saying for the last couple of years. Don't look at environment and health as parallel or separate silos. They really, impinge on each other. They affect each other. So what you do on the environment affects health. What you do in the health sector affects the environment. So there's a symbiotic relationship between the two.
If you can take some questions, there's some very interesting ones that are there. Yeah. So Deepak Gurjar has brought it up to us that he's saying that today is Children's Day. How do you ensure that the next generation, especially children, start to genuinely and actively love nature, biodiversity, and thus become sensitive to environmental issues? How can we?
The younger generation is certainly far more sensitive to environmental issues, say, compared to where we were 30 years ago or 40 years ago. That's largely because of the media, largely because of, there is economic, there is ecological awareness across the country. Very often communities are ahead of governments, and civil society is ahead of the governments. So I'm not pessimistic on that score. I'm really not pessimistic on that score. I think, people are becoming to be conscious. People are becoming aware that environment affects their livelihoods. Environment affects their health. That when we talk of forests, when we talk of land, when we talk of water, these are livelihood issues. These are livelihood concerns. And so I think people are, for me, it's not the people. It's really to make the governments really far more sensitive and far more serious when it comes to enforcing the laws and enforcing the regulations. I think the people want clean air. They want clean water. They don't want to be contaminated, by land. I mean, the chemical contamination that we are seeing across the country because of, say, pesticides. And we know now we have adequate data, adequate information. For example, to very, very confidently say that a large part of the mortality in India is on account of pollution. A substantial proportion of the growing incidence of cancer, across populations is because of environmental factors. So I think it's the governments that have to really respond far more sensitively. I think the people are quite aware of it.
That brings us perfectly to the next question by Chaitanya. He says that while we are the policies are liberalizing and there's no bottleneck of any kind, for industrial development, how does one solve this problem at a cluster, all this cluster of problems? What is your?
There's no magic formula. There's no textbook which says that this is how you bring about a balance between environment and development. We have to resolve these conflicts. We have to resolve these issues, whether a dam should be built in the upper reaches of the Ganga on the Mandakini and the Bhagirathi. There's no textbook which tells you how many dams should be built. But you have to really assess what the carrying capacity of the ecosystem is. And you have to take a decision in a democratic manner, consulting communities, consulting people. I think, we have to understand that we ultimately, our decisions in India have to be dictated by the type of political and economic and social system we have. We have an open society. We have a society in which communities have a very important role. I don't have to remind you of the Chipko movement in Uttarakhand 40 years ago, which was a movement of women to protect the forests of Uttarakhand from rapacious forest contractors. I don't have to remind you of Silent Valley in Kerala in the late 70s and early 80s, which was to protect a rainforest ecosystem of the Western Ghats. And that was a people's movement, the Narmada movement. So I think there's no formula, as I said, there's no textbook formula. Sometimes you take one step forward, you take one step backward, but you have to go through a democratic process of consultation. You have to go through a process of trying to bring together different points of view, and this is done through a participative, consultative manner. And then you arrive at a decision, and once you arrive at a decision, sometimes, it will not please all sections. Some decisions will please the environmentalists. Some decisions will please those who are arguing for faster economic growth and faster, expansion of infrastructure. So we have to find the middle path.
Sumaira Abdullahi has a question that are the budgetary provisions really, balanced enough between the development and the environment part? And how do we take a leadership role in controlling climate change and protecting the environment at the same time while developing?
Well, the only way we take leadership is not through words, but through actions. And that's why I said you can do whatever you want internationally. But if at home you're diluting and weakening all your environmental rules and laws and regulations, weakening your environmental institutions, then it's a case of double standards. So we have the environmental laws, we have the Wildlife Protection Act, we have the Water Pollution Control Act, we have the Air Pollution Control Act, we have the Forest Conservation Act, we have the Environment Protection Act, we have the Forest Rights Act. Implement those acts. We have the National Green Tribunal. Allow the National Green Tribunal to function. We have the State Pollution Control Boards and the Central Pollution Control Board. Allow the pollution control boards to function. So I think, that's no rocket science. India is not starting on a clean slate. We have had the last 40 years, 45 years, and I think Indira Gandhi was a pioneer in this regard. It was during her tenure as Prime Minister that all these laws were passed, these institutions were created. And she gave us a good head start in the late 70s and early 80s. But in the last couple of years, we have tended to privilege faster economic growth over environmental concerns. And there is a tendency to write off environmental concerns as concerns of the Jholawalas, they are not serious. But I think we should, so therefore, it's how do you make these concerns central to decision making? And what I have suggested to you is one way of making them central to decision making is to draw out the public health consequences of these environmental interventions by protecting forests, by protecting coastal marine biodiversity. What does it do to livelihoods, and what does it do to the health of communities?
Absolutely. Actually, there are a whole bunch of questions. I'm going to combine some of them and keep it brief then. One is that, in terms of as an opposition party, when we go and make commitments about at COP26, what do you think in terms of methane reduction or reduction of forest cover, or even industries like single-use plastic are being pushed in a very large way. There is no control or regulatory systems that are in place. How do you think both citizens and political, what is the political and systemic process that should be enforced? And do you think that going to courts is always the immediate solution in such a way, or how
Well,
should
that's
the
the
democratic
National Green
process function?
Tribunal. The National Green Tribunal was set up in 2010 to provide the public with an avenue for enforcing their accountability. And in many cases the National Green Tribunal has in fact helped the public. It has I know, for instance, many cases in city after city, whether it is the protection of wetlands, whether it's the protection of lakes, whether it's the protection of some endangered ecosystem, the National Green Tribunal has been effective. And because it's been effective, the government wants now to clip its wings and emasculate its scope of activity. So certainly the National Green Tribunal is an instrument that's available to civil society, that's available to the NGOs, it's available to the public. Any individual can go to the National Green Tribunal if you don't have access to either a government body or to a collective entity of private citizens. A group of private citizens can go to the National Green Tribunal. So I would encourage those of you who have environmental concerns, I would encourage you very strongly. I mean, you may knock on the doors of the government. Sometimes you have an enlightened bureaucrat, sometimes you have an enlightened politician. In the case of RA, for example, young Aditya Thackeray took a bold decision. I didn't expect him to, but he took a very bold decision, and I applaud him for that. But there are not many Aditya Thackeray's around, and for every one Aditya Thackeray, there are 10 guys waiting to whose eyes are on the RF forest area and say, what a waste of area to be in forests. Hiranandani should take it over, and build these high rises. So, you can do that. You can keep knocking on government departments. You can build up a political constituency, but you have the institutions like the National Green Tribunal, which should be used far more effectively and aggressively.
So there's a very, very interesting question by Ashish. She's saying that the idea of common but differentiated responsibilities, which the developing world is adamant on.
Sorry, common
but differentiated responsibilities.
Yes.
So when solar power is so cheap in India, why should we, do you think that we need that additional dollar incentive to move away from coal? Is that an excuse, or do we really need that kind of
don't forget that solar is only 20% of the time that you're getting electricity. So you still need, for a population of 1.3 billion, and you're adding 10, 12 million every year, you need a base load of electricity generation. And that base load comes either from coal or from nuclear. Now, if there is a breakthrough in battery technology, and if you are able to ensure that the solar power is available to you for a longer period, the pressure on expanding coal, is that much reduced. But given today's technology of conversion, today's technology of efficiency, today's battery technology, we cannot say that we are going to do away with coal. We're going to do away with nuclear. We still need that base load capacity, But however, having said that, 10 years from now, the situation can change dramatically. And I can see specific areas in which India can say that we are going to go out of fossil fuels altogether. I mean, for example, Britain has announced that by 2035, no internal combustion engines cars would be sold. I think this is eminently doable in the Indian context as well by 2040, which is just 18 years from now. Many of you will be around. You can say that no diesel cars, no petrol cars, only electric cars. That's certainly doable. But for the economy as a whole, to say that we are going to just stop, close down all coal facilities, close down all nuclear power plants, is the height of irresponsibility.
The next question is from you.
I think environmentalists also have to learn to live in the real world, you know.
The next question is from a place where you've grown up in, next to IIT Powai. Pamela wants to ask you, what is your opinion on the coastal road and the cycle track that is being built on the Powai Lake?
Well, I don't want to say anything on the coastal road, but you know, I've had enough battles with governments on environmental issues. When it came to Bombay, you know, the whole issue of the Adarsh housing cooperative and how it interfered with the coastal regulation zone. Then, of course, I had this big fight on Lavasa. You know, I was painted as a villain, as somebody who's stopping sustainable and green urbanization. So I've had my share of fights. Well, one thing I just say this, that the most robust scientific conclusion on global warming comes so far as mean sea levels are concerned. That's on which there can be no scientific debate or scientific controversy or scientific question. It's now incontrovertible that mean sea levels are going to threaten coastal areas, and therefore areas like Bombay, areas like the Sundarbans, are under great threat. I was just looking at a program the other day on television. I was just looking on my laptop, on Al Jazeera program, on how Miami, the city of Miami, population of about 2 million, 2.5 million, nothing compared to Bombay's population. But nevertheless, Miami was a city, coastal city in Florida, which is threatened by increase in sea levels and climate change, and how it is responding, to this challenge. I think this is something that, cities like Bombay should be looking at, building city resilience to issues that are of direct concern to that area. And for Bombay, it's the rise in sea levels. And this is something, and so that's why I'm very glad that Aditya Thackeray went to Glasgow. And I'm sure he would have heard people asking him about the coastal road and, how they're going to set up the coastal infrastructure and so on. Luckily, I'm not in power, so I can only advise,
If I can add an anecdote over here, that in the Sundarban region of India and Bangladesh, for 40 years, we've been fighting for this bunch of islands called the Numor Islands, which were created because of the Gangetic Plain. And now that sea level rise have happened, the Numor Islands have completely disappeared, and there is no more fight existing between India and Bangladesh over that land. I think the same might happen with the Siachen Glacier, that if we wait for a few more years, we might have the glacial melt, and the melt off might probably solve the problem between who has the ownership of that glacier. So I don't think we need those kind of situations. But yeah, at COP26, one of these young girls, she mentioned to the government that we won't wait for you to act. We will lead if you don't. We'll build the future even if you are stuck in the past. So I think, yeah. But there is a very poignant question and comment by Varsha Desai. She's asking whether the Padma Bhushan awards, that awardees that are there, in what way can they lead or bring about social change as far as environment?
Well, more independent voices speak up on environmental issues. More pressure is put on governments that environment is not a long-term luxury, but very much a short-term necessity. I think governments will be forced to listen. So I think we need to create more and more people coming out and speaking in favor of environmental conservation in the short run, not as something that we worry about in the long run. One of the great paradoxes in India is that we have a lot of Sanskrit shlokas which we can quote from the Rig Veda, the Atharva Veda, the Samaveda, the Yajurveda, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. We can always find some Sanskrit shloka to say that our ancient Indians venerated the environment. They lived with nature in harmony. They protected nature. In fact, if you go to the Ministry of Environment, the office in Delhi, is a new office built a couple of years ago. As soon as you enter, you will see a Sanskrit, saying, greeting the visitor, Prakriti Rakshati Rakshataha. Nature protects those who protect it. So, this is all great. I mean, our Prime Minister goes and quotes from the Rig Veda in Glasgow. But, shloka is no substitute for action. You can say all these shlokas, but what do you do in actual practice? That's what counts, no? You can say all the shlokas you want, and then you end up removing all the CRZ rules. You end up removing all the the weakening the environmental impact assessment process through the EIA notification. So it's we pat ourselves on the back for being a nature-based civilization. We pat ourselves on the back that Lord Ganesha, is an elephant god, right? He's a Vakratundam. He's got the curved trunk, the Vakratundam, and his Vahana is a mouse. We take great pride in the fact that we have a goddess Durga who rides a tiger, and we also have a Durga who rides on a lion. So our gods, and one of the great figures of the Ramayana is Jatayu, the vulture, right? So all this is very good for making us feel good, but it's also a substitute for not doing anything. So, and that's really what we need to focus on, not on how great our civilization is, but on how it is important to enforce these laws and regulations and standards and rules now.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Light of Asia?
Well, let me see whether I think I have. This is the Light of Asia. It's only the commercial I'll do for my book. This is the Light of Asia. It's a poem that defined the Buddha. It's a poem that was published in 1879 in England. And then it got translated into 30 languages across the world. It influenced many personalities in science and politics, in literature, people like Gandhi, Vivekananda, Tagore, Nehru, Dr. Ambedkar. It got made into film. And all our modern thinking on the life of the Buddha derives from this poem. It was written by Sir Edwin Arnold, who incidentally was principal of Deccan College in Pune between December of 1857 and February of 1860. For 2 years and 2 months, he lived in Pune. At that time, it was Pune. It was called Pune College. It later became the Deccan College. He became a scholar of Sanskrit. He became a scholar of Marathi. Translated the Gita Govinda, translated the Hitopadesha, translated the Bhagavad Gita, and of course wrote this great poem on the life of the Buddha. It's not a book on Buddhism. It's not a poem on Buddhism, but it's a poem on the Buddha. And I think the reason why I wrote this book is in the DNA of every Indian, there is Buddha. There's something about the Buddha. We may not be Buddhists in the religious or formal sense of the term, but we all carry something of the Buddha in us. He's perhaps the most captivating and fascinating figure that India has produced in the last 3,000 years. I should say the subcontinent has produced, because my friends in Nepal will be very unhappy if I say that India has produced. So what India and Nepal have produced.
So, sir, today being Children's Day, and the future or the present, I would say, belongs to them. What are your concerns and what are your suggestions to the current generation? And I say, we had a very beautiful poem read out in the morning about growing forests in your heart by Shruti Kulkarni. So I think the concept is very beautiful, that we all need to have the forest in our mind, in our heart. Sejal Vora showed us how in Mussoorie they have created a private Jabarkhet nature reserve. So what is your message to the youth of today, to the children, as to how do they, in this situation of 4 cyclones a year, and so Delhi, you can't go out because of the air pollution and smogs that are there. How do they keep themselves positive? Of course, besides reading The Light of Asia, how do they take active steps in changing their present and future?
Well, I have consciously avoided giving advice to anybody. And that's one thing I learned from the Buddha, by the way, from the life of the Buddha. Buddha said he's not God. And Buddha was not a moksha data. He was a marga data. He showed us the way. But he didn't say that, here's the recipe for moksha. So I tend to normally, when somebody asks me, what advice would you give? I tend to be very reluctant to do so, because you have to find your own you have to find your own way, you have to find your own sort of response. But all I'll say this, that these issues of the environment, we are discussing environmental issues, but there are other issues also in India, and I think the defining issue in India is the nature of society that we want to build. And my only advice to the younger generation is be tolerant, be open, be liberal, be accommodative, be respectful of diversity. And I think that's really the one message that I keep giving wherever I go, that the strength of India, diversity has defined India, but diversity should not divide India now, which is what is happening, whether it was in language, whether it's religion, whether it's a region, whether it's caste, whether it's food, you want to divide Indians, right? So I think the ability to live comfortably in diversity, the ability to recognize that diversity is a source of unity, is something that should come to us from a very young age. I was brought up, not to recognize religious differences or linguistic differences or differences in the way what people believed or spoke or ate and so on. But today that's no longer the case. The overall environment is such. There is, fanaticism of every type. There is also, by the way, eco-fanaticism. You can also be an eco-fanatic. So I think so you have to avoid this fanaticism of any kind. Like you have growth fanatics, you also have eco-fanatics. So you have to avoid these extremes.
So if we can spare a few more minutes, we have 2-3 questions. Is that okay with you, or shall we email them? Are you okay to take 2 more questions?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Thank you. So question from Dviti in Odisha. There are steps suggested by the Union of Concerned Citizens for addressing the gap between adaptation and mitigation of climate change. How, according to you, should we shift? What is the shift required for implementation?
Well, adaptation is something that we are engaged in all the time. Adaptation is a consequence of the resilience, and humanity always adapts to change. There's nothing great. In fact, I have never been very enamored of this distinction between adaptation and mitigation. But yes, we have to. Human beings adapt. Some people adapt on their own. Some people are forced to adapt. Some people adapt proactively. Some people adapt after the crisis hits. But adapt we will. Human beings are extraordinarily adaptive species. But it's the mitigation aspect that is, more controversial and more problematic. The fact that we have to adapt is a given. And we are always adapting. Migration, for example, is a form of adaptation, right? You want to migrate because you can't take these challenges in the areas where people are migrating out of the Sundarbans. And that's a form of adaptation, allowing mangroves to grow, along the coastal areas. That's a form of adaptation. So adaptation is something that is inbuilt in us, but mitigation is something far more difficult.
Yeah, I think we are very, very famous for our jugards. If I can use that,
Yes, yes, yes.
that's that's the Indian adaptation of things. Right? Question from Abhishek Kumar is that India is such a large country and cities and towns are springing up everywhere. Urbanization is absolutely sort of spreading uncontrolled. How do we prevent? Can we lay out guidelines for replication of models like Delhi or others who really become sort of toxic models? And my question additionally to that is that are there any carrying capacity studies to these places? Because what we soak in and what we leave out for the other citizens, that's where also the disparity comes in, that I take your water and I give you my garbage to handle. So we are taking from Tansa, we are taking the water away, and we are leaving them with tons and tons of sewage. So how do we prevent these models from being replicated?
Well, we have long gone past our carrying capacity. So we can do all the carrying capacity studies that you want. And the conclusion will be that we have far exceeded carrying capacity. When I was minister, we carried out a couple of carrying capacity studies in the context of rivers, for example. What's the carrying capacity of a river? What is the minimum environmental flow that you should ensure when you're building a dam on a river? So that is for a limited ecosystem. But carrying capacity of cities, India has every city, whether it's Delhi, Bombay, Hyderabad, Bangalore, Kolkata, we've long gone past our carry. One could say that India itself is probably, our population is probably well beyond our carrying capacity. So I don't set much store by these carrying capacities. But I think what is important is in the consumption patterns that we have. See, it's not population per se, but it's consumption that creates the problem. Now, take China, for example. Between 1992 and 2015, population of China was stable. In fact, marginally declining. However, in 1992, China accounted for 10% or 8% of global emissions. In 2015, China accounted for 27% of global emissions. So population stable, but the contributions to emissions going up 3 times. Why? It's consumption. It's the way you consume. So I think we should really look at sustainable lifestyles. We should look at sustainable consumption patterns, consumption as individuals, consumption as collectives, consumption as society, the recycling economy. The Germans, for example, you're collaborating with the Ebert Foundation, and the Germans have been talking about the recycling economy for quite some time. We have much lessons to learn in this regard. So it's really consumption that we have to focus on.
So the last question is from Chaitanya Mohan, where he's saying that India is a big market for big tech. It contributes about 4 to 5% of the global greenhouse emissions. But the big tech's, pro-climate rhetoric versus the policy action that is there, that's very, very mismatched. So, the amount we are putting into digital infrastructure to develop nationwide, is it really worth the volume and the velocity that
sorry for the amount of resources we are devoting to
big tech, digitalization?
Digitalization. Well, this interaction that we are having is an example of a low carbon footprint interaction. If we didn't have this interaction, what would we have been doing? We would have been meeting in the Moria Sheraton or the Claridge's, or the India International Center in some auditorium with some ACs. And instead of 100 people, we would have had 200 people who were coming in from different cities, adding to their footprint. So in a way, this is a very efficient form of communication. And it's a very low carbon footprint form of communication that we have been forced to because of COVID-19. Not because we like it, but because, we've been forced to. So yes, there are. I think that digitization, spreading the digital economy, making it available much more wider than it is in the case, will have certainly environmental benefits as well. It has many other benefits. It certainly has an environmental benefit. So but we have to ensure that digitalization does not lead to increase in inequality. That's the main thing. We have to ensure equal access. I mean, for example, in the last 15 months, we have seen that some schools have been privileged at the expense of many other schools because, they are not part of the online universe. So that shouldn't happen.
I may add, sir, actually, we were considering offline conference with a limited number of about 100 odd people. But the location that we were considering was Yusuf Meher Center, which is next to Karnala Bird Sanctuary, which is a 60-year-old, eco village in the community. And Bankar Roy spoke very, very eloquently 2 days ago. And Tilonia would have been probably another, option which would have considered. So hopefully, of course, there are the footprint of traveling on train and other things would have been higher than what we are managing to achieve now. So thank you so much for absolutely sort of blowing the top on lid on some of these issues, because I think one doesn't want to address that there are realities. I think I really liked it that we don't need to be either with the ecological aspects or with the development aspects. We need to find a centrist kind of approach. There are lots of stomachs to be filled. There are communities, structures that need to be maintained. But yeah, engagement, whether it is with the Green Tribunal or with the political process, I think young people need to. We had Jayavardhan Singh who spoke on the first day, and I think younger people getting into politics, not making it into a taboo or a sort of negative issue, because that's one of the major pillars of our country's, differentiating between several others, where imposition is the way to go. So thank you so much, one, for launching our app at such short notice, and please keep pushing the environmental agenda. Please keep asking these questions on our behalf in the places that where we cannot reach, and keeping the biodiversity agenda on the forefront, whether it is at the UNDP or at the local level that is there. And we would one last point I would like to say, that actually this conference is going to culminate into a climate actioners manual. So what you talked about, that if all this talk doesn't turn into action, then it's going to be pointless. So all the 7 books that we are planning, a series of climate change books. I told you the Coastal Life of Mumbai is one of the books that is there. There is one on RA which is coming up. So there's a whole series of how people can take action. Protecting biodiversity is an action. Documenting urban wildlife is another action. Understanding what our ecological footprints and who our neighbors are. In Coimbatore, we have elephants walking into our neighborhood. In Bombay, we have the blue whale, sometimes coming to our coastlines. So Delhi has the Aravalli ranges, which is the oldest mountain range. So I think one needs to understand that we are living on a living planet, and our rivers are not just pathways for taking sewage out. So thank you so much for joining us today. And Manvi, a few words from you.
No, thank you, Anand. You have summed it up nicely. And what more to say after Shri Jairam Ramesh? Really don't have words, but I would also like to thank all the participants for asking these very important questions, and also Shri Jairam Ramesh for extending his time and giving us some responses, no advices. But I'm sure that some of us would want to come back to you for some advice.
Oh, you have my email. You're welcome
Yes.
to share my email.
Sure.
Anybody who wants to email me can email me.
That's so generous, and thank you so much. We'll be in touch definitely with you. And I would like to close this session with your permission.
Thank you.
And have a nice evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anand.